Okay, today we're going to start our lesson on chapter 4, which is entitled Culture and Social Media. Within these lessons, we're going to look at where cultural groups are distributed. We're going to get into leisure and material culture and how it's distributed. We're going to look at access to culture and how it's unequal all over the world. And we're also going to look at how some cultures around the world face our old friends' sustainability challenges and so on. Today's lesson is entitled Where Are Cultural Groups Distributed? And as you're looking at the images right there, you can see the great variety that this class has to offer, and it's no different when we talk about culture. In chapter 1, we had a real good definition of culture, and it was the body of material traits, customary beliefs, and social forms that together constitute the distinct tradition of a group of people. Now, that is a very big boy and big girl definition. Other definitions of culture are very simple, all right? And we'll talk about those three out. Now, in our first part of our lesson, we're going to really look at the material traits, the body of the material traits, and we'll talk about a couple of those important elements right here from the start. Now, the first thing we're going to talk about is how culture, social media, and geography all basically go together. Now, like I said, we are going to talk first in this chapter about the concept of material traits. These are the traits of what a group possesses and what a group leaves behind. It's these little visible elements that a group possesses and leaves behind for the future. Okay, and that's what we're going to be talking about. Now, geographers like to search for various elements of culture all over the world, and they like to talk about and observe why all these distributions occur and so on. Okay, one question that we have to answer before we move on is, how does culture influence behavior around the world? Well, at this point, there are two terms that we talk about. One is called habit, all right, a habit of a person. And you can think about your own habits that you have individually. Well, habit is a repetitive act of an individual. It's a single individual. It's like in the old days where I remember as a teacher, I would wear jeans to class every single day. That was just a typical habit that I would have. Now, the other word that we use to answer this question is custom. Custom is different from habit because it's the same concept. It's a repetitive act of an entire group of people. Okay? Habit does not have to be an act that's adopted by most people in society's population, all right? It's just the individual. In fact, I was doing some research and looking at habits and customs, and even though that image there, the animated image, is of 19 strange Dutch habits and customs, if you check that out and search that, it actually shows you the differences between habits that an individual has compared to the customs that a group of people have. And it helps to answer the question about how culture influences our behavior. Now, this lesson is very fascinating because on the front you saw the band Nirvana, and you also saw Ronald McDonald. You also saw this. Well, we're going to talk about wine here in the next part of our lesson, and there's definitely something on Earth called wine geography, which gives us a good example of how culture and social media and geography all go together. Okay. Wine geography basically is influenced by the environment and social customs, okay? It gets into the environment, obviously, with the geography. Wine geography basically is the wine production that is given throughout the world. As you're looking at your images there, you can see the tons of wine that is created on Earth, okay? The purple areas basically are basically 1 million plus tons of wine that is produced in a year. You can see those dark purple colors there in the United States, southern part of South America, Argentinian, China, Australia, South Africa, excuse me, and obviously the wine producing countries in Europe. Wine was created first in Greece, basically the grapes and so on, and some other civilizations had it as well, a form of it. But it's a good example of how we can show how basically the environmental and the cultural elements basically influence where wine is produced all over the world. And it's a great example of how all these three things basically work together. Now, the second part of class, and probably the most important one, is we look at basically two types, okay, of culture. The two types of culture that geographers have divided it into is called folk culture and pop culture. Those are two terms that we basically know, we have basically heard of before. And we're also going to touch on the concept of origin. Origin, which is a factor that talks about how popular and folk cultures or customs are distributed. All right. Now, folk culture is pretty simple. It's on a very small level. It's a traditional type of culture that is practiced by a small amount of people that have similar groups in a very isolated area of the world. Okay? Folk culture is practiced on a much smaller level than pop culture. Okay? Now, it originates from an anonymous source. Okay? We don't exactly know how to track where folk cultures were created. Okay, and that's what we mean by an anonymous source. It's very hard to come up with where a folk cultural tradition started or originated. Pop culture is a little bit different. Pop culture is basically found in very large societies that have a bunch of different groups of people that practice these certain habits. Okay. Now, despite the different personal characteristics of these people that practice pop culture, they still share the similar habits and customs, okay? Pop culture can be summed up right here in this image, all right? We see Ronald McDonald, we see the Pikachu or whatever, Pikachu, whatever his name is. We see Homer Simpson, we see Winnie the Pooh, we see Bugs Bunny, okay? A great image of pop culture there. Now, pop culture is influenced on a much bigger level around the world because of communication. All right, more people have access to things related to pop culture than folk culture. Folk culture basically can only be spread through through migration. All right, when someone moves to a place, then they talk about folk culture. Pop culture is basically diffused all over the world because of our improvements in global connections dealing with communications around the world. The origin of where popular culture traditions start, the origin of it is very traceable. We know where basically the majority of all things in pop culture have started. Now, the two elements of culture that we're going to talk about within this chapter, basically, we're going to get at the daily necessities of food, clothing, and shelter. We're also going to get into leisure activities and arts and recreation, as we're going to see throughout these lessons that we have, okay? Now, the second thing we're going to talk about is cultural geography and the elements of it. Well, the first one we already talked about, and that was origin, all right? But we're going to talk about it a little bit more. Now, there are three basic processes that are called, that's origin, diffusion, and distribution of how we handle pop culture and folk culture, okay? We already basically talked about origin a little bit, but there's a word that we have to talk about, and it's called hearth, the hearth. Now, hearth is basically where culture originates, where it starts. Hearth is a very simple concept to understand, and that's basically it. We already talked about where folk culture originates. It's hard to figure out where it does. Pop culture is a lot easier to find the origin, okay? Let's give an example. A great example of origin and where something, and we're going to talk about pop culture stuff here, has to do with music, And there's a type of music called grunge music. I'm going to channel my inner coolness here and try to explain this. So grunge music is a mix between metal rock and alternative rock, okay? It was started in Seattle, Washington in the 80s and the 90s. And yes, that is the time period when I was in middle school, I was in high school, I lived during this concept of grunge music hitting the world, basically. It's hearth with Seattle. This is where it started. This genre of music later had turned into a fashion, okay? So the bands that we're talking about here are Pearl Jam, Nirvana. You can see the image there that says grunge is not just a music, it is now a style. And it's just not the only genre of music that has basically turned into a fashion and absolutely taken over the pop cultural world, okay? And my brother-in-law is a Pearl Jam crazo. I mean, he'll go to Istanbul, Turkey. He's been to London. He goes to Italy, and has huge cult followings of people that go to see them play. And that's basically where it started from. All right, and it's a good example of origin, where something in pop culture starts. Hip hop, for my hip hop fans in the crowd, it definitely has a similar story, which we'll definitely talk about and look at in our next little section here. Okay. So diffusion basically is how it moves, all right? How it moves. Now, we already know, and I already talked to you, that folk culture is basically transmitted and distributed through relocation, diffusion, or migration. Pop culture is a little bit easier, right? It moves all over the world because of the increase in population. Folk culture spreads a lot slower and on a much smaller scale, okay, as we already talked about. We already talked about how popular culture spreads rapidly through communications, okay? Let's look at hip hop, all right? We gave love to my grunge and Nirvana and Pearl Jam fans in the crowd. Let's look at our hip hop, and it's a great story of how it starts, and it shows a good example of diffusion, how popular cultural trends move, okay? So hip hop actually starts in the Bronx, New York, okay? And it started in like 1973. I wasn't even born yet, okay, when hip hop actually started. There was a DJ called Kool Herc that's going to start it in 1973 in the Bronx, okay? So it starts in 1973 and slowly begins to move to Western Europe, and then Japan, and then the Caribbean. Later on, hip hop is going to move to Latin America, Asia, and Africa more recently. Now we're talking more recently within the last 20 years or so. Now, hip hop over the years has become less popular as it has diffused, and many things in pop culture, many examples or traditions or customs that are formed in pop culture, as they move around the world, as they diffuse and more people get access to it, in some cases, like in hip hop, it becomes less popular to the people of the world. In fact, hip hop has basically taken a back seat to alternative hip hop, which is a little more popular these days. And it's funny how alternative hip hop has basically its origin, its hearth is still on the eastern coast of the United States. An example of an alternative hip hop group is the Beastie Boys. I admit that I did listen to Cypress Hill growing up in high school. If you want to Google and search those, you definitely can for you music fans in the crowd. But it's just a great example of the diffusion, the movement of pop culture around the world, and how it changes the view of people around the world dealing with these types of topics. Now, distribution is the third element, basically, of how popular and folk cultures are distributed, all right? Basically, the distribution is influenced by access to content around the world, okay? So people are going to catch wind and grab onto pop cultural traditions that are started around the world according to how much access they have. Access. And this is where we get into the social media thing a little bit, but it also shows you the differences of how pop cultural items are distributed around the world. What we're going to do is we're going to look at the area of the Himalayas in our world, and we're going to look at art, and we're going to talk about how pop culture in certain places are distributed across countries, all right, and how very different things are according to the access that people have, the access to content that people have around the world. So basically artistic customs, all right, art basically around this area of our world, the Himalayas, which includes the countries of China and India and Pakistan and Nepal and Bhutan and some countries in Southeast Asia, all right, you're going to see how these customs, these pop cultural customs dealing with art, are influenced by the environment and influenced through religion. Now, in the northern region of the Himalayas, you have the Buddhists, okay? And their art, as you can see in the diagram and in the image above, you can see that it basically, Buddhists portray religious events, influenced by religion, definitely. And it's also, Buddhist art is basically influenced by the horrible environment that they live in, all right? Cold areas of Nepal, up in the mountains and so on. That's basically what their art's all about. Now, if you go into the southern region of the Himalayas, you have the Hindus of India. And their artistic stuff is more about everyday life and little local scenes. All right, you can see the elephants, you can see that, you can see the family scene in a lot of Hindu art. And it does definitely, along with the Buddhists, portray some violent climate conditions there as it gets into the Himalayas, in the mountains, and so on. Now, if you look at the Muslim art, or the example of it there, the Muslims are found in the western part of the Himalayas, there in Pakistan and so on. You can see that there are plants, there are flowers. The conditions are not as extreme. And that influence, obviously, pop art, or art that is found by the Muslims. And then you can also see folk religionists, or folk religion. That's basically a characteristic of people that live in Southeast Asia, like Myanmar and Vietnam and other places in Southeast Asia. People have migrated east, all right? So they usually paint symbols and designs dealing with religion, all right? And they don't really focus on the physical environment too much. So this was just an example to show you how different parts of pop culture are influenced in different parts of the world, but in same areas of the world, according to the access of the content that they have. Now, speaking of the social media part of this lesson, all right, the last part of the lesson we're going to talk about today is the diffusion of electronic communications. Okay, so there are increases to access to pop culture and folk culture around the world, according to how much access a person has. Internet access is what we're talking about, access to different platforms and so on. Okay, now we're going to stop and we're going to talk about cell phones and smartphones. All right, so this map does a real good job showing you the amount of cell phones per 1,000 persons in an area in 2005. This was 15 years ago, guys. 15 years ago. In 2005, you can see the amount of cell phones that a person had in the world in 2005. There are only a pocket of areas of the world in 2005 where the cell phones per 1,000 persons were 1,000 and above. Okay, you can see that is in the countries of Europe. You can see there Sweden, Norway, Finland, London, or England, and Italy. All right, you can see the United States. You can see China. You can see India. You can see the communication basic experts and leaders of the world 15 years ago were not on par to those folks that were in Europe. Okay, now fast forward 12 years as far as the diagram is concerned in 2017. Now look at how cell phone use has taken off. Absolutely taken off. Okay. And you can see where it is all over the world, which also means that now people have access. They have access to popular cultural items. They have access to folk cultural items as people are migrating around the world and bringing their folk culture with them, okay? You can see how that's changed over time. One example that we can look at, is the cell phone use in Africa. It's become tremendously common. There's traditional landlines are scarce, which is the reason why electricity has been limited in Africa. But cell phones don't require a big investment, connecting wires to a building and so on, which basically those services are being given to the people of Africa. So you can look at the cell phone service here. Somewhere around the 2010s to 2015, somewhere around this area, you can see this map shows the percentage of people that lack electricity. You can see exactly where those places are. You can also look at the little pie charts there. That's the percent of people that have cell phones, okay? And you can see those areas are improving, but still very, very behind the rest of the world. Now, that's a look at the cell phones. That's a look at the electricity that people lack in Africa, which is why they're gaining a little bit more access, but obviously not as much as the world. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about are the most popular social networks in the world. And we're going to start with Facebook. In 2004, Facebook was created in Massachusetts, okay? The map shows you exactly where the most popular social networks are in the world. In 2009, there was a vast variety of social networks, okay? Facebook jumps on the scene in 2004, okay? In 5 years, you can see all the purple areas on the top map of where Facebook was located around the world and where it was in use. Obviously, North America was huge. You can see all of Australia had jumped on the bandwagon and so on. If you look at South America and if you look at Mexico, you can see that there were other social network platforms that were being used in Mexico and in different parts of South America. You can see in Africa that there are different parts there and so on. Now, one thing that we have to look at is China and Russia. There are countries that are very consistent with their social networks. Russia will not allow Facebook. China does not allow Facebook in their countries, okay? Those countries have total control over social media and over their people, and they have their own social networks that they use, and you can see those names. Now, if you look closely at 2018, look how the Western Hemisphere has changed, all right? Look how Facebook has totally taken over in 9 years. Basically, every single country, the main social network that they use is Facebook, all right? You can also see how Facebook has picked up around the world in African countries and so on, okay? And you can also see in Africa, to go along with our last map, how electricity is improving, how access is improving. They're using different social networks as well in those areas that had none simply 11 years ago in 2009. Now, another idea about access, how people are affected by it, we can look at Google Street View. I don't know if you guys ever use this and so on, but you sometimes see those Google little street cars moving around, get in the Google streets and see how that's affected by access. Here's the availability of Google Street View around the world, okay? Around the world, you can see there are the basic dark green areas have full or partial Google Street View. All right, you can see those areas around the world. You're probably thinking to yourself, well, why isn't China and India involved in this? I mean, they don't want to be. They don't want to give access to Google Street View and so on. Plus, it's hard to get there. Government restrictions don't allow Google to get in there. All right, so it's very hard to do that. And Africa seems very disinterested in Google Street View altogether. Part of that is the limited electricity. Part of that is limited access and so on. So this does a real good job of showing you how people have access and don't have access. And we use the example of Google Street View for that.